So, welcome in this very late hour. So, this talk is on the occasion of the book presentation of these two Serge Daney publications. It may seem like a rather odd gathering. First of all, this is a conference on Godard, not on Daney. Second, none of us really are specialists of Daney or maybe even Godard. But still, there is something we all have in common, and that is a certain experience in film criticism. Boris is a philosopher and a cultural theorist, but he told me that the first text he ever wrote was a film critique. Eyal is a filmmaker who also regularly writes or talks and teaches about film. I mainly work as an art critic, but I also started long ago as a film critic. But I hope, as will become clear from what follows, that well, I think that, or I have a very strong feeling that Daney would have very much have liked it this way. Maybe I should say some things about Daney for those of you who are not familiar with him, because very few of his texts have been translated until now. He's a French film critic. He's born in 1944, which is at the end of World War II. For Daney, this is the year when Rossellini finished or started working on Roma Città Aperta, which is very important for him because it's the beginning of modern cinema. He grew up in Paris with his mother. They went to the cinema a lot. She chose the melodramas, he chose the more adventurous work. A film that marked his adolescent life is Nuit et Brouillard, Night and Fog, the film by Alain Resnais. And the critique, I think Solange already mentioned it this afternoon, introducing the film on Jacques Rivette. The critique that marked his life as a young cinephile, let's say, is Rivette's text on Capo, a film by Gil Pontecorvo, which deals with the same issues René deals with in his film. But for Rivette, this is an aestheticization of the same issues, the same events of the camps in World War II. So talking about Daney is like entering a time capsule. It is going back in history, his personal history, but also an important part of post-war cultural history. He wrote his first text for the Cahiers du Cinéma in 1964 on Howard Hawks, Rio Lobo, but it could also have been Rio Bravo. The remake of his own film, he wrote on both films, in fact, Daney. And like Hawks made remakes of his own films, Daney often made remakes of his own texts. He became chief editor of the same magazine in 1973, which is the, let's say, the Marxist-Leninist period of the Cahiers, and which runs more or less parallel with the Group Zigavertov, where Godard also was part of, and in which, for instance, he also made Ici et Ailleurs, of which Eyal already showed some fragments. It's all a long time ago, just like the times when Daney went writing for Libération, the French newspaper, first about tennis. He was a reporter on Roland Garros, and Following that, he went writing on film and finally on television, which is quite important. This happens in the 80s and the early 90s. There is also kind of a parallel with the works of Godard. It comes after his laboratory period where he worked for television, where he starts using video, and not unimportant, where he also works with his affection for tennis in his films. The last thing that Daney did in his life was the foundation of Traffic, which is, you could say, a late film magazine, maybe one of the last film magazines. This happened a few months before his death, in 1992. He lived just long enough to be a witness of the first issue and to contribute to several issues that followed that. This may seem like an anachronism because Traffic came at a time when film magazines were seriously thinking about what to write about and how to write about film. The magazine I wrote for instance, was edited by a film club for which I used to work for. It became a media magazine around the time of Traffic. The film club consequently became a part of a museum of contemporary art. And finally, the magazine ceased to exist and merged with an international arts magazine. You may know the magazine, After All, in which quite regularly also there still are film critiques published. But I think this is all very significant for a certain shift in film criticism and film culture in general. So this is to say that although Daney was best known as a film critic, it is important to know that he was also one of the first media critics in a time where we only had media theorists. Yeah? He was also a rather polemical and political art critic, in fact. And this is all part of this movement that marked his life back and forth. He traveled the world, but he always came back, just like he writes about the future, but always looks or thinks about the past. And this back and forth movement brings us to the title of this meeting, A Space to Move In. And it is there that I would like to start this discussion. But first I want to say a few words about some concepts of history. In the introduction to the book, I write about some parallels between the conception of history with Daney, Godard, and Deleuze. Daney writes about it in La Rampe, in the text which is called La Rampe bis, which is in fact a kind of a remake, repetition, a summary of the book, where he divides the history of cinema into a short period of classical cinema before the war, right after the silent film. And classical cinema can be recognized by a certain notion of depth. It is what Daney calls l'âge d'or de la scénographie. So the decor, the editing, gracious movements of still actors that all are used to forget the scene. After the war, this notion of depth disappears, and an image is nothing more than an image. It is the end of scenography. People had seen enough of the mise en scène during the war. Maybe we can illustrate this with a shift with two very similar but radically different scenes. The first comes from Sherlock Jr., a film by Buster Keaton, in which he leaves the projection booth to enter the space of film in the screen. So he comes out of the projection room in the back of the cinema and steps into the screen in the front of the cinema. Daney uses this image at the end of his book. The second image comes from Godard, Le Carabinier, in which Michel-Ange, one of the soldiers in the film, tries to get a glimpse from the inside of a tub with the bathing woman, but he falls through the screen. So he rips the screen, and he sees that after the image in the screen, there is another image, that of the wall. So every image hides an image, hides an image, hides an image. So Daney looks at the history of cinema in very spatial terms. For Godard, the filmed image is like a system of beliefs. In his Histoire du cinéma, the war also stands at the center, but there it is a division of a period in which people could believe in the cinema and a period in which people lost their beliefs, which is illustrated by Godard in Histoire du cinéma with the images of Jean Renoir, La Grande Illusion, or Charles Chaplin, The Great Dictator, which announced the events of the war but couldn't prevent what would happen in the war. And then for Deleuze, finally, which is not important because both Deleuze and Daney were readers and admirers of each other's works. So for Deleuze, the spectator plays an essential role. He has a personalized approach of the cinema, and his film history starts from the position or the point of view and the relation of the actor and the spectator. So before the war, we see the spectator as kind of an actor engaged in the events on the screen, which is taken to a high end in the films of Hitchcock, of course, and is what Deleuze calls his action image. And after the war, we have a reversal of this, where the spectator becomes, or the actor becomes kind of a spectator on screen. He is lost in these desolate landscapes, desolate images after the war in the films of Rossellini, Roma Città Aperta, but also in the films of Antonioni or the films of Fassbinder much later. So when I tried out to find out what could be a possible follow-up on these cinema books of Gilles Deleuze, I had to think of Serge Daney. I saw an evolution of this movement image of Deleuze going towards a time image after the war, towards a possible space image of which Daney already wrote a substantial part. So the question is no longer how can we ever believe in the image again, which was the question of Godard, or how can we actively be engaged again in the events on the screen, which was Deleuze's question. Now, the question now is how can we become part of this space of cinema again, in which writing about film, what Daney did, is also already making films, becoming part of the films. So this is where I want to like to start this discussion with this or these conceptions of history. The question is, are they still useful today? And what can we do with this idea of the image as space? Can it be of any help for an actualization of film history?
Should I start? Okay. I also tackled this problem in my paper. It is very simplified. If we ask today about what Godard and his oeuvre means to us today, what could be an approach to his film work from our position today, this question, the problem with this question is that there is already an answer. This is the answer of the already existing film history. But of course, it is the problem of the universality of this film history, of the type of what we can call canonization. We all somehow suppose that there is already existing canon of universal film history. It is, in a popular understanding, it is similar to what Goethe thought about you know, the universal the world literature in his sense. The world literature were those works, literature works, which at the best way articulated what is universal in the humans. Of course, later we know all of them were white, all of them were male. It was only the Western history. So the idea of universal history has become particular, and we know this. The same is the problem with the film history. Additionally, especially, you know, it's also national film history, French history, French New Wave, Yugoslav New Wave, other new waves. The problem is whether we are able to think essentially different about what is film history, about this canonization. And introducing such questions as what is political in Godard's work, or as for me, what is political in the Yugoslav new film, my answer or the problem was, okay, it was political in terms that these films were a certain, the expression of a certain contradiction and antagonism of that time. But today, they are not political anymore. So that because the antagonism of which they were expression has disappeared historically. And my offer was to subvert this idea of canonization, to subvert this connection between identity and cultural history, which is also the question of cultural heritage, to subvert it in terms of provoking some sort, I call it a translation, which is Eyal also mentioned Benjamin, and I was mentioning Benjamin, and in fact I didn't finish my paper, and the last thing I wanted to say, this is a beautiful you know, we know this famous sentence by Walter Benjamin about works of that every document, cultural document of the past, could be
of barbarism.
Document of barbarism. But there is the next sentence, which is always forgotten, following this one sentence. This sentence simply says that the problem lies in our perception of cultural history. Simply, Benjamin says, it is the cultural history as we perceive it which prevent us to understand this ambivalence that every document of culture could be at the same time document of barbarism. And the question for Benjamin was how to get rid of the cultural history, of all these collections, of all these canons, to free, to liberate people of this burden of all these canons, so that they can use it. So, which means, again, we have these canons, we have these containers full of values, of knowledge, of all this, every national identity, every cultural identity has these canons, and film history too. But the problem is how to liberate ourselves from this pressure, so that we can use it, so that we can I would say also reawaken it, reawaken not only the political meaning, but also aesthetical value, which is not the value existing somewhere in this package, in this collection. Let's say collection, but the value that provokes its reproduction, that urges us to produce new values. And this is also Benjamin's idea, is that the past could have some meaning to us only if we can be opened to the future, only if we are able to feel it with the present, to so to say, to activate the present in this past. This is generally the problem for me, how to deal with the film history. It could be that the film history, this massive knowledge and all these canons could be an obstacle for us to make it productive. Well, this is very general introduction. Probably you, Eyal, would you like to?
I think that the last time that I had the occasion to sit next to Boris and to have a talk, it was maybe 10 years or 12 years ago in New Delhi. It's impressive to see, to what extent we kind of dialogue in 10 years without speaking to each other. But beside the fact that I'm totally following, I would like to point what it seems to me the big problem of the attitude, in the attitude of writing history of cinema, and it's the notion of subversion. Not subversion, subversion. When you accept the idea of subversion, in fact, you're reaffirming exactly what you don't want to affirm, the canon, the gods. And this, what I propose, in fact, is the notion of profanation. That won't be a subversion, it will be a profanation. And profanation, we have to remember that the profanation is the moment that we take something from the gods and we give it to the people. But it means also to recognize that, in fact, the secular writing of history failed. We must consider the post-secular vision of history, which means that secularism and cinema appears in the moment of secularization. Godard reminds us that cinema, the quality of cinema, is that we watch it up, right? Like we watch in the church, the Jew hanged on the wall, right? And the cinema is suffering for us, the cinema is the redemption, etc. But secularization, that moment of secularization doesn't go without the colonialism and without the declaration of who is the other, which means who is not us. And this idea of profanation, it's first of all to profound to the very deep idea of the cinema as a secular practice. I mean, to detach from the secular practice. On practical terms, what I mean is, in fact, the question of the archive. This, I think, that it's the real issue. I mean, what it means today to write an history which will profound those elements which already became the archive of this so-called universal humanity. And it's to, first of all, to make a strict distinction between the storage and the archive, which are not the same thing. And Godard shows it in history of cinema. The storage is the place that doesn't leave, where everything exists over there. The moment that the storage become an archive, it's the moment that it's re-articulated, which means, first of all, there is the de-archive in order to re-archive it. And we cannot think about it without the question of the rights, the author's rights. And again, I want to quote Godard in a very interesting and quite surprising interview that he gives to Eyal in France, when he's asked about the question of the rights. He said, what are the author's rights? And he answers, he said, but authors do not have rights, they have duties. In fact, authors do not have duties. And then we have to ask what, in fact, he means beside the excellent, once again, game of words, but what he means about this notion of the duty. And the duty, I think, which is exactly this duty of de-archiving and re-archiving, questioning exactly what it means, those classics, and what are the mechanics and structures that made the classics. And this is, I think, kind of a permanent call that exists today on the level of students, of young filmmakers, which is the understanding, somewhere, kind of this understanding that you must define the classic in order to be avant-garde, but more than that, yes, to kill the father. To kill the father. This is a condition, and this is the profanation that I mean. It means that it's to have a critical take on those that are the new untouchable, Godard, Rivette, and all the new waves. Which, in fact, what is the new wave? I mean, it's a 3 old person with gray hair like us, right? This is the new wave. It's nothing new in that new wave. And then we come to that simple question, I mean, the simple problematic question, which is, what is to make film politically, in fact, isn't it? What is to write a political history of cinema?
Maybe the question is to go beyond this idea of classic film, huh? And to
the classic is the canon. I mean, I'm using by purpose this notion of the classic.
Etymologically, do you know that the word classic comes actually from classici? Classici in Rome are the highest ranks of taxpayers. Well, the richest people. And what is very interesting that German romantics were totally aware of the barbarian character of German language and German culture at that time, let's say, 18th century. And they knew that German language could attain the quality, the classical quality, only through translations from Greek and Latin, which means that their idea of the canon, of their own identity, was that the classical character should come from the outside, from the past, from an other archive that is already dead at that time, so that reawakening of the old archive is what makes this particular, at that particular moment of history, which is German language, classical. Gives the moment of the classical comes out, comes through translation, comes from the past, comes from a different archive, from the archive of a different culture. It is something foreign. It is something coming from the outside. This is very interesting how the quality of being classical emerges.
If there are any questions from the floor, you can always raise your hand, although we cannot see you, but or shout. I think we should say some more about Assayas. It also fits in this idea of spatial thinking, an image to move in. Ici, ailleurs, here, elsewhere. It's also the film which Daney the most often took with him when he traveled around. He was not only a writer, but he was also somebody who liked to talk, who liked to discuss films. And Ici, ailleurs is probably the film he discussed and he showed the most. So it's a film about space and time. Godard moves to Palestine, ailleurs, and 5 times later with Méville finishes the film in France, Ici, or on France maybe. He starts from the events on the ground, Ici, there Palestine becomes Ici, and finally makes a film on media, ailleurs, there France becomes ailleurs. So here and elsewhere are very interchangeable. But also important is that these 5 years Godard worked on Ici, ailleurs are also the 5 years of the group Dziga-Vertov. In a way it was the first and the last film they made as a group. It was in this period that they were very much occupied with this idea of making political films in a political way. And when I heard you talking this afternoon about the black wave in Yugoslavia, I had the impression that you needed a whole context to understand the film, to translate it, to bring it back to life. While when I look again at a film as Ici, ailleurs, for me this is still a very contemporary movie, which still talks about today and which you. And this is maybe this has to do with this idea of making films in a political way. This is a film in 3 movements, a film in which starts out with propaganda images, in which these are put in question when we face films from TV, from the media, and finally goes back to these films of the Fedayeen, which are really ordered by the Fedayeen, where they tell Godard what he has to film. So it is this system of politically filmmaking where he criticizes himself that maybe makes this film still as contemporary as it is.
I would like to say something about Ici, ailleurs in order to first of all, to contextualize. if today somebody would have done a film like Ici Ailleurs, it would be banned in most of European countries. This, I think that it's important, with all those laws against Holocaust denial and racism and whatever, this film will be banned. And also another thing to remind that, I mean, the last film of Godard, which is film socialism, which he uses things from Ici Ailleurs, was seen in France by 25,000 people, and Ici Ailleurs was never a success. I mean, a kind of a success. There are more people that are saying that they saw it than people who's really seen it. I think that's...
It's still becoming a success.
Yeah, but I think the quality of Ici Ailleurs in its what we feel, I think, three of us, it's very contemporary and imminent. I mean, permanent emergency, permanent kind of creating the real state of exception, as saying Benjamin, is the fact that Ici Ailleurs is one of the rare films that are against cinema. It's not just a critique, it's not just a free movement thing. It's a film which is against cinema. I mean, it's a film which is against cinema and makes the link that Daney did in his life, which is that cinema goes to the TV. I mean, Daney became not a media critic, television program critique in a moment, because he understood that box. And we know when we understand it, what is the net? I mean, we can become, and maybe some should become, YouTube critique. You know, but another element to contextualize is this fantastic question about, it's not about making political film, but it's about making film politically. And when we look a bit about the writing about the sentence, in fact, there was the idea of controlling, making the link between production and distribution, and taking control over distribution. And I mentioned YouTube, or we could mention Vimeo. What is this act of uploading and deciding that you can share or not share, give or not share? I mean, it would be a cynical situation to consider that, in fact, through those medias, this fulfilled the dream of taking control over distribution. It would mean that every person that dances in the bathroom with his guitar in front of television and decide to upload on his Facebook, in fact, is making a film politically. If we take it clearly, the idea that you take control over distribution. I think that the making film politically, we have to understand what is it, a cinema against cinema?
This is, I like this radical move, because it opens possibility to think about different influences on Godard, or different story. We can tell a different story about where this idea comes from. I'll tell you. There are obviously two positions. Either is this Ici Ailleurs the problem, or the making films in a way which is self-reflexive. This is the tradition of the so-called philosophy of consciousness, which you have at the end the subject that is that has its, as German or Hegel would say, Entstehungsgeschichte, the history of its becoming transparent to itself, so that the way of producing films is at the same time reflected and transparent to the subject that produces this film. This is this classical position. But the position of a cinema that is against cinema, this is the tradition of avant-garde. It is not this tradition of transparency. This is a different tradition. This is you know, this is the moment, this is deeply modernist moment of negation. When you just, you don't make out of your filmmaking a history that is transparent to you, your activity that is transparent, that, you know, the moment where the knowledge and the making is one and the same, but you negate not only the past, you negate the very nature of the medium. You negate this negation. This is deeply modernist. This is avant-garde. This is, you know, the avant-garde, which is the birthplace also of the film, modern film. We know this, but we know there are so funny stories about Soviet avant-garde. You know the Boris Groys general idea about the avant-garde art, Gesamtkunstwerk Stalin. The idea is that the greatest avant-garde artist was actually Stalin, who realized the idea of all the previous avant-garde artists. Their idea was to change the world, not to make better, you know, more beautiful art, but to change the world. And simply Stalin did it. Stalin, Hitler, and so on. But of course, we forget these things, this deep impact of avant-garde, not only on the history of art, but it is like you know, the moment of Soviet industrialization, all these large steel, Magnitogorsk steelworks, they were produced by American engineers and architects during the 30s in the Stalinism. How? Soviets sold the French paintings, you know, from the 19th century. They sold it to Americans in exchange for the knowledge, for the engineers and architects. And Magnitogorsk is, in the 30s, built, you know, the model was Pittsburgh. This is direct application and contact between capitalism and Soviet Stalinism, Soviet Stalinist socialism. But how was it possible, you know, to say, well, Matisse, Gauguin, and so on, you know, we will change it for knowledge of the engineers? Because the avant-garde de-evaluated all these paintings. They told, this is shit. So give this shit to the Americans and build something useful like steelworks. So that this idea of negation could really have deep impact, even where you wouldn't expect it.
On two points, kind of one in parenthesis, which is when I'm talking also about the cinema which is against cinema, it's a permanent reminder of what Boris is saying. I mean, the fulfillment of the totalitarian idea, which is the control over time and space, right? What's the totalitarian idea? The control over history, language, time, and space, right? It's cinema. I mean, this is the fulfillment. It's over there, on one hand. And I think that there is a strange dialogue, permanent strange dialogue, conscious and unconscious, which is not really important, between Godard and Steven Spielberg in a way. I mean, the biggest regression over Ici Ailleurs, it's in fact Steven Spielberg with the film E.T. E.T., it's exactly the of Godard and Ici Ailleurs. And if you think about how finishes E.T., I would say this is the real regression. This is what is E.T. E.T. finishes with the idea of E.T. go home, right? What is go home? Ailleurs. So There is something fantastic between, and after will be, of course, will be the same thing will be repeated in Schindler's List with the fact that what is the last scene of the Schindler's List? It means those people that are going and coming, so-called coming back home, right? Palestine, Israel in that case. So this will be a permanent, and now we can start to think, beside Duel of Spielberg, how Spielberg, in fact, it's the permanent regression against the cinema, which is against cinema all the time. I mean, this is an important articulation for me. Another element which I found quite incredible in Isia, your contemporary, that many critiques and writers are writing about Isaïa and using the notion of a video essay. Right? You find, you will look at people are talking about a video essay. Well, we know that it's not made in video, and why it is a video essay? Because the idea that you can break linearity, it can be only video in this case. So and this is the act of the act of Isaïa, trying to break this linearity that is imposed by the timeline. We have to start in a beginning, and we have to be in the middle, and then we will be in the end. And this doesn't exist anymore in ici et ailleurs. But this idea of the cinema, which is against the cinema, it will be, if we think about what it means today, a cinema which is against the cinema, it will be a political making against the political film, the political œuvre d'art, which is polluting all the exhibitions and all the shows. I mean, you see, and there is only political artworks do not reveal at all the fact that there is an occupation of a public space. And I think that like this we have to consider the 5 years that they're not really working on Ici et Ailleurs. They started a film which is Jusqu'à la victoire, Until Victory, commissioned by PLO, by Fatah, in fact, paid by the Arab League. And then there is 5 years, and those 5 years, this is the research. It's not, I don't think that it's the editing. I looked, like many others, is there any cut of that film? And in fact, there is no cut of Jusqu'à la victoire. A few days ago, I had the occasion to speak with an important figure of that time, which is Serge Leperon, that did Olivier, and knew at the time the Ziegler group. He said there is no cut of that. But there was something, the idea that the time of the research is in fact the time that the author, in this case, have the duty that he can defend in the public space the work. What I mean in defend, it's not to give this, what we have today, the artist talk, but engage within a political discourse that exists. It's not the political over, the political discourse. And this is the duty that they impose themselves. And I think that we feel it in Ici et Ailleurs. We feel that there are the people that are engaging in the permanent political discourse.
Well, yeah, I don't think it's only research, the 5 years that it took to finish the film. It's also a matter of production. They had to make other films to earn money to finish this one. So they made all these other
I think that if they will do, you remember there is this question about the language of the film, because they believed that they can do a film in Arabic. This was the problem. And then there was the question of the translation. Not anymore the translation of of the language. But there was the problem of how you translate. And Isaïo, many passages in Arabic are still in Arabic. But there is this a small thing that once again, Serge Leperon, when I asked him about this thing of Palestine that they are going to Palestine, that they are trying to say, said, we are the generation of that war, which is the big break of the Second World War. And in those years, we believed that that the Palestinian revolution can transform us. Not transform Palestine for someone, it can transform us. And this is maybe what happened in those 5 years, that in fact it did. Anyway, to Godard, to Mieville, to Godard, it transformed them.
Yeah, I mean, this moment of transformation, when the event somewhere else, a year, transforms the spectator, this is very old problem. This is Kantian problem. This was the problem of the French Revolution. The idea of Kant's idea about who is in possession of the truth of French Revolution. Not those who act, not those who were making this revolution, but the spectators, concretely in Germany, outside, who from the outside were as Kant says, without any interest, looking at the event. They gave the real meaning of, they produced the real meaning of the event. So that the truth of a historical event is dislocated. It is a year. It is not ici. In the moment where the event really happens. This is also the possibility to understand. This is when you say it must transform ici from a year.
And also, I like very much your idea of a film against film. I think it's very tempting to follow you there, but it's more, I'm still convinced that it's more a critique of film, and it's not a negation, it's an affirmation of film. And the reason that he kept on making films until Film Socialisme, which he made at 80, is still a critique of cinema, but it's an affirmation of film also. And maybe what links Film Socialisme with the CIR is also the different kinds of dispositives he uses, from the cell phone to the high definition camera, which is.
He sang it somewhere. He sang it somewhere in the debate. Would say against Claude Lanzmann, when he kind of dismisses Shoah of Lanzmann. And it's interesting to understand why he dismisses Shoah. Because he says, and this is maybe the transformation, he says, the cinema that should be done is the cinema on the perpetrators, that put in the center of the image the perpetrator. And this way, what I mean also by the idea, or I understand by the idea of against cinema. We shouldn't forget that once again, that the process of secularization, the building of the secular church, which is the cinema, from its very beginning, from its invention, puts the other, invents the other as the figure of redemption. The workers coming out of the factory. And after the worker, the gardener. I mean, my gardener, my tailor. And who else? The baby. And this is the thing. The victim, the one that is the weak one, this will become the figure of the cinema, if we consider that what was invented is documentary and fiction is just a genre of that. And this is the moment of the break. It's not anymore about going ailleurs, sending the cameras to the Orient like did Frères Lumière. It's not anymore going to the poor areas to film in the prison, you know, all this work that is the permanent work that we done in the name of course, humanism and universality to criminal figures. We don't have to insist on it, but it's about returning to the EC, to film the EC, to return the camera. And this is what Godard, in fact, is doing. In this sense, it's against cinema, against the pattern of cinema.
Okay. I think our time is up.